Welcome to Represent NYC on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. I'm New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, and today I'm joined by two guests who represent Manhattan's West Side in elected office. Since she was elected to the City Council in 2013, Helen Rosenthal has been an outspoken advocate for increased funding for nonprofit service providers and fought for gender equity and more affordable housing. Helen, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my goodness, thank you for having me.
I see you all across the city, not just on the West Side. You are boundless in energy, and it's been really a privilege to get to know you and to work with you on so many issues. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here.
Thank you for having me. You know, the truth of the matter is I love the Upper West Side, and we have a lot of issues here, and there's a lot to work on. But as chair of the Committee on Women and Gender Equity, that brings me out to the rest of the city. Yeah. And I see what's going on, you know, in areas that have less than the Upper West Side does. And it really affords me the opportunity to understand what the needs of all New Yorkers are.
Women's issues, family issues, gender equity, forefront in all the presidential discussions going on, and you're in a leadership role, and I know it parallels the great work you did, where we really got to know each other well on the issue of contracts for our nonprofit service providers and some of the ways in which you fought hard to make sure that they could get the resources they need to deliver for people in need. So, I mean, that's a big area, but you've been doing a lot in there. So let's talk about what your current priorities are, what you've been working on, what you'd still like to see accomplished.
Well, thank you for that. You know, here's the thing about our contracts. When the city doesn't provide a service itself, right? The city workers themselves don't build bridges. City workers themselves don't service seniors. What we do is we contract out for those services. And when we contract out for a bridge, the bridge builder says it's going to cost $40 million. And we write a check for $40 million and give it to them. When a senior services center says it's going to cost us $4 million to take care of our seniors, we write them a check for $3.5 million. And we say, good luck with that. Yeah. So the first issue is this disconnect between the private sector that can demand a market payment and the nonprofit sector, which is doing mission-driven work and for a variety of historic reasons accepts the check for $3.5 million. So there's that first problem. The second problem is the city is just a terrible payer. So I don't know about you, but in my house, I pay the bills. And when I pay the bills on time, you know, there are no problems. Yeah. But if I'm a late payer, I get charged a fee, right? Or somebody won't provide the work for me anymore. In the city, when we're a late payer, there are really no consequences. Yeah. And so we can be 6 months to a year and a half late in payments. And the work I've done as chair of the Committee on Contracts and now chair of the Committee on Women and Gender Equity has been to address and try to resolve those issues. One of the things we first talked about was, could the city prepay for a service? And unfortunately not.
Couldn't get there, yeah.
Yeah,
and we've had the same issues, as you know, on the state level. And one of the things we do in the Comptroller's office is we do our annual prompt contracting report. And it's some of the agencies are chronic late enters onto contract. And the problem is, if the contract is late, then certainly the payment's going to be late because the whole process is pushed back. And although at the state level, you can charge interest if your contract is late, most agencies work around that requirement. So even what was meant to be some teeth from the legislature doesn't always work. But you made a difference in having the city be more efficient.
You know, we've had some really great results. First of all, under the de Blasio administration, unlike previously, there have been 3 increases in payments to nonprofits. First, we've increased payments for pay. We've finally given workers a COLA. We've increased payments for overhead. Rents are going up, the
Administrative
cost of
costs,
food, all that.
yeah,
and
yeah.
the city had never paid for those increases, so now we pay for that. And now we're paying for full overhead rates.
Yeah.
So this is a big deal
Yeah.
and will have a tremendous impact on those providers, which is great. But we're still not good at paying quickly.
Yeah.
So I have a piece of legislation that's traveling through the legislative process right now that will actually hold the city accountable for each one of the agencies. So if it's sitting in the law department, that contract, it only has 2 days to turn that around.
Oh.
If it's sitting in the Department of Investigation, it only has 2 days to turn that around.
Yeah.
We're going to hold the city's feet to the fire step by step in order to get those nonprofits paid faster.
Yeah, it's especially frustrating if you're a nonprofit that has ongoing contract with us. So they're always having to re-up, and they always fall further behind. And some of them, as you know, hopefully you haven't had too many of this in recent times at the city level, but we've had it in some of the really tough times at state level where they go out of business. They just can't afford to stay in business anymore.
That's right. So here we are talking about contracts,
Yeah.
right? There could not be, for most people, here we are, two people who are fascinated by procurement. We're interested in it. But as I like to say, contracts are sexy. That's what I believe. But if we don't get the contracts right, there are consequences on New Yorkers. Our nonprofits take care of 2.5 million New Yorkers. And if we don't get it right, the consequences are on those New Yorkers.
Yeah.
So the contracts may sound like a distant thing, but really they have important, critical consequences.
And government couldn't do it without
Right.
the nonprofit
That's
sector.
right.
And when we talk about the city's economy and employment, and the states as well, too often when we talk about the nonprofit sector, we talk about like a cost. Well, it costs money. It is a key part of employment statewide. And so when a nonprofit is struggling, and perhaps to meet their costs because their contracts are laid on paper, they have to lay people off, that hurts the overall employment. So we need to
Exactly.
recognize the contributions, not just in terms of quality of life, which is
Yeah.
key, but also as part of the overall mix of the employment sector in the city and the state that the nonprofits provide. It's significant.
It is, and it always stuns me to hear that some of our employees in senior centers or at daycare centers or after-school programs are on food stamps,
Yeah, yeah.
sleep in shelters.
Yeah.
It's remarkable.
Yeah. And you have a lot of people who are doing it because that's their passion. They could make more money somewhere else, but they want to provide services to people.
And one of the things I find really interesting is that the controller's office in the city, I don't know about the state, has a responsibility to look at prevailing wage. In other words, in the construction field,
Yeah.
we make sure that
Yeah.
construction workers are paid prevailing wage, which is the promise.
Yeah.
Not so in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah,
something
that's
that,
interesting, yeah.
right? Why not bring
Yeah.
that to the nonprofit sector as well?
Yeah.
Why not say there's a prevailing wage for a daycare worker?
Yeah.
In New York City, most of our households are led by female, single
Yeah.
heads of households.
Yeah.
They should be being paid a prevailing wage.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the differences between state control and city control. We don't, on the construction side, do that prevailing wage piece. But while we're on the topic, in terms of very often these programs that are helping people who are often in the shadows and issues of social justice are key. You've been in the press lately, and I want to talk about this and the broader implications on the issue of bias in medicine and ways to try to address that. How does that fit in with your agenda on equity for all?
Great. Well, appreciate your asking about this. Last year, we had a hearing about maternal mortality and morbidity. In other words, during childbirth, what happens to women? And what we found, and is common across the country, is that Black women die at a rate far disproportionate to white women. In New York City 10 years ago, it was 8 times as frequently as white women. Now it's closer to 6. And it spreads over socioeconomic class. Doesn't matter if you're giving birth at Lenox Hill or, somewhere else. One of the public hospitals, Black women die and have near-death experiences at a far higher rate. And during our hearing, what we learned about was the stresses of being a Black woman and the consequence that has on the woman's body during their lifetime, and then at this crucial moment during childbirth. One of the feeders is this implicit bias, explicit as well, but implicit bias that's taught in medical schools about Black people that has been carried down since slavery.
Wow. Those numbers you cited were remarkable. Let's talk about some other numbers. You had in a past life worked for New York City Office of Management and Budget, so you're a numbers person.
Yeah.
And you already alluded to some of the changes you'd like to see in terms of the Comptroller's Office to be more helpful on these issues. I know you have a great concern about retirement security. It's a big issue out there. To me, it should be the one they're talking about nationally, and unfortunately that's not happening. But strength of pension funds, public pension funds, is an issue. As you know, at the state level, we recently reduced our assumed rate of return from 7% to 6.8, long-term, what we expect our return to be. Share your thoughts on how you see that retirement security issue from the perspective of our public pension funds right now. How would you like to see that handled?
Well, we have to pay our retirees. Full stop. That's our obligation. And the question is simply, do we pay it out of our investments and the return, or do we pay it out of current public dollars? And we have to be honest about it with ourselves. And I was so struck by your decision to decrease the projected rate of return. The consequence was that current taxpayers may be paying more for our retirees. It's a cost to the current budget. One of the things that I think is a difference between the state and the city is we have rating agencies at the city level bearing down on us, right? The city is required, because of the 1974 almost going bankrupt.
Right, fiscal crisis.
We're required to have a balanced budget for 4 years. So if the city controller were to do that, the consequence would pop right up in the city's budget. It would be immediately seen that if we did not have revenues to cover that cost, we would have to cut programs somewhere else. I don't think you have to necessarily deal with that at the state, and yet you're being fiscally responsible.
And, I think it's about positioning for the future. This stock market bull run is not going to go on forever. And not that our funds are only invested in the stock market, they're not. And actually the city, because we have different fiscal years, benefited from the June 30th, because June was that quarter was a good one. But we, from a transparency perspective, we certainly have to report as well. And you're right that the difficulty is we want a position for the long term, and I think being a bit more conservative on your assumptions makes sense. But if we fall short, you're right, it'll be more of a hit on taxpayers, and you don't want to erode the public support for fully funding our public pensions.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
100%.
Because you see the states that are in trouble, very often it's because they've underfunded their pensions during the good times. You come up to 08, 09 with the global financial crisis. You look at states like Illinois, even Jersey, not too far away, Kentucky, and some others. Michigan. They're still not back to where they were, 10 years ago. Whereas in New York, for the city and the state, we were just better positioned to weather that storm.
Right, and the reality is the consequences fall on retirees, the last people we want it to fall on.
But similar to what we're talking about with the nonprofit sector, people don't understand the importance of public retirees having security. And with the New York State plan, and I think it's probably similar for the city, 80% of our retirees do not move away. They stay right in New York State. And we're now paying out about $1 billion a month, $12 billion a year in benefits. 80% of that $12 billion staying right here in the economy of New York State. That's an important stabilizing factor in the economy, especially in many of our smaller communities upstate where they've been having issues with population. So
No, and similarly in New York City, we're the largest employer, right? 400,000 employees. So if we mess around with that, the impact on the economy is serious.
Well, you have a big agenda, a lot going on, and maybe you'll be able to influence that controller agenda in more powerful ways in the not too distant future. Good luck. Good luck. We're just about out of time. Councilwoman, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Always great to talk to you,
We'll
Tom.
see
really
you
appreciate you.
not just on the west side, we'll see you all across the city.
100%.
Councilwoman Rosenthal, thank you for your fearless advocacy. You are an important voice in New York City for all New Yorkers. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to be back in a few moments with my next guest. Welcome back to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. For the past 17 years, residents of the Upper West Side, Manhattan Valley, and Morningside Heights have chosen Assemblymember Daniel O'Donnell to fight for their interests in the state legislature. I know he'll have a lot to say about what's been going on in Albany and the issues that he's working on. Danny, thanks so much for taking time to be with us.
It is my pleasure.
We had the privilege to serve together when I was in the legislature. We continue to have a great partnership in my current role. I have to say, served with many wonderful people, but you stand out as one of the colleagues that always called it like you saw it. Always a strong voice for progressive change in Albany. You've been sticking with it a long time. I can't believe how many years we've both been there, but thank you for never giving up and for really making a difference. I think of issues like marriage equality that we celebrate so much. You were in the forefront of making sure that happened. The issue of bullying that we still talk about that's happening too often in our schools, the Dignity for All Students Act, again, you were a great champion. A lot of progress on criminal justice reform. You've always been a leader in that regard, and you chaired the Corrections Committee for a period of time. You've got so much going on. And this year in Albany, big changes with the state Senate majority flipping. Give us your perspective as to looking at 2019 session. What, from your perspective, what was good, what still needs to be done as we look forward to the 2020 session? Before you know it, we'll be going back to deal with that.
Before you know it, yes, indeed. And when we go and when we leave and when we come back, it's still unresolved because of the issue about primaries.
Yeah.
You know, one of the interesting things that I didn't foresee in the changing of the Senate is a changing in the dynamic in Albany. When you were there, and for all the time I've been there, we in the Assembly always moved first on pieces of legislation. It was just what it was. And we would move first, and then the Senate would join us. And so that was flipped on its head this year. And so you take pieces of legislation that you've been carrying and passing in the Assembly for 4 or 5 years, and now all of a sudden the Senate's moving first. And it can be frustrating because, you know, people in this business, they want credit for the work that they've done. But it also sometimes felt like out of control, you know, because they would pass bills before you had ever gotten around to the part of saying, are they perfect? You know, in the Assembly, we would pass bills that weren't perfect with the full knowledge the Senate would never take them up. So that was a very big change.
You are a brutally honest individual.
I am. I am. People want the credit for coming up with the idea. It's helpful because I am an attorney, so I have the capacity to read the legislation and maybe with a little bit more scrutiny than others. But it's the nature of the beast, and so that was a very big change. I don't believe, I could be wrong, that there is a single piece of legislation in this session that the Assembly was the first to pass it.
Really? Wow.
It was all Senate.
It's interesting because one of the things that I had heard, you had a lot of bills, like you say, there were one-house bills that might have been drafted 10, 15 years ago, a long time ago, and suddenly they're moving and folks hadn't looked at them for 10 or 15 years, and there might have been some ways to make it even better, but in the speed to try to get things done as part of the new day in Albany, you know, I think some of what you're identifying absolutely was part of the dynamic.
Well, a perfect example of that was the Non-Discrimination Act, which was passed the year before I got there in 2002. Deborah Glick, my dear friend, was nice enough to bring me to the bill signing with the governor. And because I was elected but did not yet begin to serve, well, that did not include gender identity expression. The trans community was in it because at the time it was originally written, no one felt it was necessary to specifically delineate them. And then the thought was, well, we'll get to it next year, and it took a decade or more, right? And so in the end, you need to be careful because you think you can come back tomorrow and fix an omission, and maybe you can and maybe you can't.
Yeah. You have an important chairmanship now with the tourism, what's the full title? Tourism, Parks, Arts, and Sports Development. That's a big agenda. And not just in New York City, but certainly in New York City. I mean, tourism and culture has driven so much of not only the quality of life, but the economy as well. And now your responsibilities, though, are statewide. Give us a sense of what you've been doing with that committee, how you see moving forward for the city, for New York State. How can we better take advantage of all those great opportunities within tourism, arts, sports development, and culture?
There's a lot of things to do in those. I asked for this committee. I've been on the committee since I got there. Some of the interesting things are there's a city, non-city divide. People outside the city of New York don't think the city of New York needs any help, right? So there's that issue. The reality is tourism is a major economic engine in the state of New York, and people don't fully take that in. It's billions and billions of dollars. Every money you spend in the arts returns 7 times that dollar into the coffers of the state and local governments. And so it's not something that we can just ignore and expect to keep rolling. And it also, I think we need to be respectful of our history and where we are. I don't know if you saw, was a very interesting article by my friend Jason Haber in the Times the other day about Robert Moses and what his history is. And, you know, essentially it's a racist history. And if they can take down Confederate statues in New Orleans, we can take Robert Moses' name off our state parks. And that is something that I intend to try to do come January, because he built, and I'm going to be full disclosure here, I learned to swim at Robert Moses State Park. I got there on the Robert Moses Causeway. So I had a view of him that's very different than what the reality is now. And the truth is that he built those highways so that buses couldn't go on them, to keep people who didn't have cars from having access to those parks. So those are some of the things that can be done. We're also trying to rename another state park after 45. We're trying to get rid of that too, but that's Ms. Rosick's bill, and I intend to help her do that. But so it's funding, it's keeping the institutions going, it is making sure that they have access. You know, you have places like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you would think doesn't have financial needs. They need a new roof. And if you need a new roof, you need a new roof. And
that's a big roof.
It's a very big roof, and it's a very important roof, and what's underneath it is incredibly important. I mean, if you go there on any day, the line to get in is down the street. And people travel to New York for our institutions, for our theaters, for our tennis. You know, the U.S. Open brings in more money in 2 weeks than all the other sports teams combined. And so we need to make sure that all those things are able to be and continue to be, so that we can get the money to keep our city and state going.
The stewardship for the parkland is very important too, and I know that dovetails with your work on the Environmental Conservation Committee. That's another committee you've been on for, you know, for a long period of time. And with all the discussion about quality of environment, climate change and so on, keeping our green space, to me, is so very, very important. Tell us, from your perspective, what will be the impact of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? And for our viewers who may not know much about it, it's kind of a cumbersome title, if you ask me, for a very important piece of legislation that kind of came together towards the end of session. I think many people were doubtful that it was going to happen, and then it did happen. But just remind us what's involved with that and your views on how New York is positioning to deal with that issue of climate change.
So climate change is real. We all know that. We're witnessing the effects of it every day.
Well, there's that one fellow that seems to say it's not real, right?
There are some deniers, that's true, and they also believe Barack Obama was born outside the United States. So we ignore them, and we go forward. And we know that we need to change the way we fuel ourselves and how we provide the quality of life that we've grown accustomed to. We cannot rely on the current supply of carbon fuel to do that. And there are many different ways that we can move that forward. Among the things I learned in this debate this year is that you can make natural gas out of manure. And then you talk about upstate and farm communities where there's a lot of manure It won't get us off the natural gas entirely, but if you're replacing with something that comes from manure, that's probably better than the other ways to get it.
And it becomes part of a transition.
That's correct.
Yeah.
We need to be able to transition, but we also need to know that we need to stop building infrastructure to rely on what we have. We don't want to build pipelines, because pipelines say we're going to continue doing the same thing. So we need to create a mechanism and a way to support solar and wind energies. And, people, I have a friend who's a management consultant. He makes a lot of money. And one of the things that he does is works with technology. And in terms of how in our lifetime, how far we've come technology, we're going to go that far in a year. Mm-hmm. Like, it's so sped up that you and I can't contemplate what the next way to get off of carbon fuel is. Mm-hmm. But it's something that I committed to from the day I got elected. I've worked very closely with Barbara Lifton out of Ithaca to lead the anti-fracking movement in the state assembly.
Which has been successful in New York.
Which has been successful, yeah. and it was not easy. And many people say we didn't go far enough. But we're not fracking, right? Yeah. So, it requires a teamwork of people from different places. I'll never forget the first hearing I attended. One of the lobbyists for the fuel energy said to me, "Well, are they fracking in your neighborhood?" Referring to the Upper West Side. And I said, "Well, are they fracking in Loudonville?" Because that's where she lived. Anyway, you push me, I push back. Yeah. But in the end, I think it requires a lot of people and a lot of commitment, and it requires leadership from the government to say the way it currently is not acceptable.
So you are one that would subscribe to the notion that the aggressive, ambitious goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are included in that legislation, that in fact we can meet those goals.
I believe we can meet them, and I believe we have to try to meet them. And if you don't try, you're never going to succeed. Yeah. The people who, on the other side, or the people who say they don't do enough, well, let's get to those before we get, to turn the lights off.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard, and as you know, the legislature has different people from different constituencies that have very different opinions. We have those issues around LGBT rights. We have those issues around women's control of their bodies. We have those issues around guns. It's a very big, diverse state. You know that. You're the controller.
Yep.
But in the end, we all need to do this for the next generation. So there's a planet to leave them.
I mean, you started as a grassroots, public interest attorney fighting for people in neighborhoods. The rent laws, big issue in Albany this year. How are you feeling about the outcome?
I'm very pleased with the outcome. It's not perfect, but it has one extraordinary important thing. It doesn't expire. And what we have lived with every year since I got there is next year or the year after that, we'd have to go back and fight the same battle again. We don't have to do that. And to the extent that it's not perfect, we have an opportunity to fix those things that are not perfect without running the risk of throwing all those tenants out of their homes.
And keeping New York City affordable for people will continue to be a big issue and a big concern, right?
It's a very big concern, and it's a very big victory.
Yeah. You are direct and you are honest. You're a person of integrity. You've been one of the leading voices on how to reform the legislative process to be more open and transparent and accountable. And I appreciate that you hang in there and you fight for your constituents on the West Side. You really fight for all New Yorkers that need a strong voice. So keep doing what you're doing, my friend. This has been a great conversation. Thank you, Danny, for taking the time to join me today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope we have provided a thoughtful discussion of issues that affect New York City. My thanks again to Council Member Helen Rosenthal and Assemblymember Danny O'Donnell. I'm New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli. Thank you for watching Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network.